Geek talk. Let's enjoy the show. Talaman always got a twang. Geek talk is popping where it's really at. Represents geek culture. Homie got structure. Sometimes it's focus. Real catch culture. Feel like Goofy, smart to say the least. Loving One Piece, man, really loves to eat. Everybody knows the show is really is Talaman. You know what time it is. Let's go. Geek talk.
X-Men. Fucking weebs. X-Men.
Heroes by day, losers by night. Can't get laid to save their lives. Untouchable, unrelatable, being awkward, yeah, that's undeniable. Unavailable X-Men, that's the proof. Widows in action, yeah, that's the proof. Even when they win, yeah, they quickly lose because they act the fool. They're not even cool, undateable, undeniable, indescribable, unrelatable. Out there for the world to see. Even they act like they can't believe, yeah. X-Men.
Hello and welcome. We got another episode of Geek Talk with Tyler. And as always, I'm your host, Tyler. Today I'll be joined by my guest. How you doing today?
I am doing okay. How are you?
Good. Would you like to tell the audience a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, anything you're currently working on?
Sure. So I am Cody Banning. I'm an actor, SAG-eligible actor, voiceover artist, and I'm also an author. I write under the pen name W.C. Banning. Right now, we just recorded the pilot for Discounted, the animated series, and I have Stuff Tales from Places out, and I should have my first full-length novel out at the end of this year.
Terrific. Now, for this month, we're going to be discussing about how fans affect fandom. Now, this episode was your actually idea, so would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. You and I had just talked about some things that kind of how fans influence the making of things, and this just kind of popped into my head. Just some examples as to why creators sometimes will bend to what the fandom actually wanted done in a series, and these are some examples I came up with to fit that. Yep.
Right. So, in short, our topic's going to be how fans affect upcoming reboots of popular series.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of where I organically went with it. That's kind of the direction I went in, and how the interest of fans can affect what creators do and even change them, mid-course, and especially remaking old nostalgic properties into new things.
Now, it's no secret that there are a whole bunch of Batman cartoons, several Spider-Man, several Superman, for that matter.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's personally interesting that a lot of the quote-unquote reboots that happen are based off comic book characters. We have like 4 Turtles series, at least like 5 different Spider-Man animated series. I'm not going to even talk about all the Batman stuff out there. He's like the 3rd most best-selling comic book character of all time.
And we've had, I believe it's something along the line of 13 Batmen and 9 Supermen by this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly surprised we've never had a Wonder Woman animated series.
It was kind of explored very briefly with, it was more an adult oriented series, but with DC's Bombshells series. Was very short-lived back I think it was in the late aughts that it came out, but it was very short-lived. She was kind of one of the main characters in that, but didn't last long. I don't know. That's kind of shocking to me.
I mean, isn't she like the most famous female comic book character of all time?
She almost has to be. I mean, they really all kind of started with her. I know she had a spinoff from the Super Friends back in like the 70s or 80s, but once again, it was part of one of those segmented cartoon television shows where they had different segments, and it was partnered with the Super Friends. So, yeah, she's never really had her own standalone. It's very strange.
I mean, even Green Lantern had one of those.
Yeah. There was a Green Lantern cartoon that came about like in the late '90s, early 2000s, around the same time as that Hulk cartoon that was actually pretty decent. And it was done by the same studio, I believe, that did the original X-Men cartoons.
I mean,
Uh,
I think this was like the Marvel's DCAU.
yeah. It was very interesting, and some of their most popular, especially as far as cult favorites go, cartoons came from that era. Avengers Assemble comes directly to mind because that's still a lot of folks' favorite Marvel animated property to this day.
Really? So they just never grew up with X-Men?
Yeah, so a lot of folks did, but it's that weird kind of very beginning of the of Gen Z, end of the millennials kind of thing. Actually, it'd be more middle millennial, frankly, that would have been all about the Avengers Assemble stuff. People born like 90 to 95, they kind of missed the train on X-Men and other stuff that came around that time. It's funny even to talk to my nephew who is about 11 years younger than me. It's pretty interesting to talk to him about things that happened during that time and ask him if he remembers Power Rangers and things like that. And he says he does, but he remembers later versions of it. He remembers Turbo and things like that. And he doesn't remember Mighty Morphin like I do.
Well, I think that's a real reason to explore generation gaps. Like many people today are more familiar with the new DuckTales as opposed to the classic '87 one.
Sure. Yeah. It's a really common thing. I think part of that has to do with the popularity of some of the voice actors. I mean, you have some big names in there, David Tennant and a number of others that are in that show that a lot of adults have followed. So it's gotten a lot more ratings than cartoons did when we were little, but that's also a funny thing and something that could be kind of a subject for a later podcast, but is how much more popular cartoons are with millennials and Gen Z than they were with boomers and generations before, because a lot of those folks didn't grow up with ready access to TV, and we were kind of raised by TV as millennials. So it's very interesting that there's a lot more adult-centric cartoons, and even the cartoons for children have things put into them that the adults can enjoy almost always nowadays.
Yeah, that's pretty much Animaniacs.
Yeah, sure. Sure. I feel like it kind of started with The Simpsons and Animaniacs and things like that, because you did have that Gen X era of people who kind of grew up with cartoons and wanted adult cartoon stuff. But we have so much more now. I mean, we've seen in our lifetimes, in the lifetime of millennials. I'm 41. I was born in '83, and in my lifetime, I have seen the rise of Adult Swim. I have seen back in the day when you used to have the MTV animation hours for adults at the end, back in at the end of their broadcast day. I think it was called MTV After Dark, but they had things like Eon Flux and other shows like that, and they showed some anime back before there were things like Crunchyroll and Toonami and things.
Yeah, you can really tell how old a person is by saying where they first saw anime, whether it's the 4Kids or even Adult Swim with the whole Toonami situation, or even if they had those tapes growing up. Like I did. I had
Sure.
the old Kimba the White Lion tapes.
Oh yeah. FHE Home Entertainment. One of my first was Siebert the Seal. It was actually huge in Japan. I only had a couple of VHSs of it because it never got very gigantic over here in the States. It never got syndication, but I had a couple of those.
That definitely takes me back.
Yeah, and PBS. A lot of people forget that anime used to be played on PBS. Fairly late at night.
In particular?
It was mainly Ghibli. early Ghibli stuff. I remember seeing Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind on there.
Well, to be fair, that whole studio was owned by the dubbed version anyway, was done by Disney, so that just makes sense.
Right, this was pre-Disney. This was before Disney had actually acquired the property, when they were still distributed in the States by, I think it was one of the bigger anime studios. I don't want to say which, because I'm going to say the wrong one. It was one of two, but if I say it, it was either Studio Dentsu or Studio Piero, the folks who did Cowboy Bebop.
It's supposed to be French.
Yeah, it was either Dentsu or them that had the rights at the time, and they actually were trying to push more anime into the States, but it didn't take hold until the late 90s. Pokemon and stuff like that kind of normalized.
Shows like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, pretty much almost anything for kids related, people do forget is anime.
Oh yeah. And I mean, a lot of folks forget Transformers also. That was a big show for me as a kid, and a lot of folks forget Transformers was technically anime.
Oh sure, I mean, if we're going to go technically, Japan defines anime as anything animated, but I mean,
right.
If that's the case, try finding Avatar: The Last Airbender on Crunchyroll.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the studio that did Avatar was I think it was a 50-50 split. Most of the folks who worked there, 50-50 split between Japanese animators and Korean animators, if I remember correctly. I actually had a buddy that was doing a podcast about that not long ago, and they were talking about the split of animators and the old in-between animation that is way more common with Eastern animators, more so than it is with Western animators, and how a lot of the Western animators that worked on that were having issues with doing in-betweens.
Well, I mean, and this is a common thread, there are a few exceptions, but a lot of times when stuff gets rebooted, it gets a new animation. Like, let's look at DuckTales, for example. It has the Disney afternoon style of animation, whereas the reboot version has more of a comic book feel to it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you run across the problem of a lot of old hat fans, wanting to get mad at the new type of animation, wanting to get mad at what they call the Cal Art style of animation, which they call anything. They don't like Cal Arts. They don't necessarily, I don't think, understand what Cal Arts animation actually is. They just get mad and call everything Cal Arts. But that's going to happen with any reboot. And oddly enough, as we were talking about, it has changed things for a lot of rebooted properties.
Well, I mean, I think we need to ask ourselves, what do you think an appropriate amount of time between reboots are? Because we got the first TMNT reboot, that was about, I want to say, a 10-year or so difference from when the original cartoon ended. And then the next one, it was only 3 years. And then following that was about a year after that one ended.
Yeah. And it was, it's very strange. There is almost universal hate, I've noticed, and I'm a fairly big TMNT fan. I grew up with the original comics and the original 87 show. 1987, good year for animation. Speaking of animation, ton of stuff happened in 87. But yeah, I grew up with the originals and the original Mirage comics and everything, and everyone hates almost universally Rise. It has its fan base, and its fan base is rabid. They will defend it to the end, but I don't understand all the hate behind it, and I often don't understand the hate behind some of the reboots, because we can't expect it just to be the same thing made over. But even sometimes when it is the same thing made over again, the fans still have an issue with it. And case in point would be Masters of the Universe, the new Kevin Smith series. People have despised that. People have accused it of all kinds of things, even though it has stayed pretty true to the original property.
Well, I think that's the key aspect of you doing any reboot. As long as you have some degree, staying true to the original property, then there really shouldn't be any other main complaints. I think that's why we have a lot of universal hatred for shows like Thundercats Roar, Teen Titans Go, Velma.
Velma's just Velma's just a bad show and poorly written. That's all I will say for it. It's the same thing I say about the Rings of Power. I don't really necessarily dislike it because it messed with the original property as much as I do that the quality is just horrible. And Velma is one of those things that I absolutely despise. It has what I call the Marilyn Manson disease. It was just doing things to try to be edgy, and I'm perfectly fine for you to do things to try to be diverse and to try to change things up. I love that. I love seeing it. I think it's great. But
as long as they didn't like make it the overall point of the character, I think that's we can both agree on there.
As long as they don't make it the overall point of the character, but also as long as they don't do things just to shock one side of the aisle. You find so often
South Park has done that for a couple of their episodes.
They have.
In another episode, they'll shock somebody else.
That's the difference, I think, with South Park, and that's always been the difference. I believe that the South Park rule has always been make fun of everybody. It's the same as the Simpsons, and I think that's why they've gotten away with what they've gotten away with, as long as they've gotten away with it. But you find a lot of these programs that will swing one way or the other, swing to one side of the aisle or the other, and try to focus more on their agenda than making the cartoon, and then more than making quality content. That's when that's when you start getting problems. But my main problem is shock value. Anyone who's trying to do something just for shock value, if the story is inherently shocking just because of the way the story is, that's perfectly fine. But making a show just for it to have shock value, making a show just so you can show that Velma is a horrible person, that I had problems with that.
I think this is a whole way of doing a self-insertion thing. I mean, obviously Velma was the wrong way to do it. I mean, it's cool
Sure.
if you want to see yourself as somebody and not make religion, gender, ethnic persuasion the real issue. But then going out of your way to completely contradict what you're saying, I honestly don't know what they were going for.
It's shock value. That's all they were going for. We've had this conversation as kids on a debate team because we were talking about shock rockers and Marilyn Manson and all of the stuff back in the 90s, that Limp Bizkit and all those guys that were just there to shock people. And I always bring up Last Caress by the Misfits. It's a much older song than that, but it's hilarious because someone once asked Glenn Danzig, why did you write such a shocking song? What was the point? And he was like, his exact words were to put you all off, to make you all feel uncomfortable. And that's exactly why he did it. And I think sometimes when you're doing things like Super Gel, I never understood, like that cartoon. Never understood.
I had to watch Super Gel and half the other shit on it.
You must have to. I get sometimes the Midnight Gospel. I understand that because it is the whole plot that they are getting dosed on psilocybin and doing a podcast. So I get that one. But Super Gel, I feel like took itself too seriously, and it was just I'm fine if you're going to be absurd or shocking and not try to take yourself seriously at the same time. But if you're going to do both, it just becomes laughable to me. And I feel like that was the disease with Thundercats Go, Thundercats Roar. I feel like that's the disease.
Difference.
Same difference. I feel like that's the disease that thing had. It was going out there. They had said, all these fanboys are mad at us. We're going to do something just to tick them off. And we're going to turn the Thundercats into these goofy Teen Titans Go, almost Steven Universe-esque characters.
And the
I
real
love
issue is that they actually got some pretty good talent for that show.
they did, but
Not just
they
that,
did.
What you call it, freaking Teen Titans Go as well. They actually kept the original cast.
Oh yeah, no, it had they both had potential to be good. They both had potential to quote unquote stick it to the man. They both had potential to spit in the eye of conventionality if they had have done it correctly, if they hadn't have done it just for shock value. But I feel like so much of that was played for shock value. Now, did they find an audience? I don't think Thundercats Roar found much of an audience, obviously, but
Thundercats in general was kind of a cult classic thing.
Sure.
It was based in the same studio that did those freaking Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer's cartoons.
No, yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for that studio, and I want to say it was Rankin Bass, but I think I'm wrong.
No, actually, it was Rankin Bass. They
was it
also
Rankin?
did a couple of movies. They did one of the Lord of the Rings animated films. They did The Hobbit from the 70s.
They did a ton of stuff. Yeah, they did a ton of pretty decent stuff that was on level with Don Bluth. I'd almost say their stuff was on level with Don Bluth. I mean, I believe they were responsible also for The Last Unicorn.
I was going to follow up with, yes.
Flight of the Dragons, and a number of other things there. But the point is, those fan bases, you have to be careful. To our original point, you have to be careful with those fan bases because you can kill entirely your show if you're not careful with the fan base you're aiming at. And it's like the 2011 reboot of Thundercats. It was such a fan favorite, but they listened to the studio and the studio said, hey, we're not really getting the numbers we should be getting. The studio failed to realize that Thundercats had always been kind of a cult property, but it was building
the initial reboot, right?
Right. The very first one, the one they did back in 2011, where they brought in a bunch of the animators from Avatar. They brought in the studio that did Avatar. They brought in a ton. It was wonderful. That is
kind of the issue when reboots do happen. It's not going to have the initial successor. Wolverine and the X-Men is another example. Right. Spectacular Spider-Man.
Yep.
Thundercats, as you've mentioned.
And they were all great. In my opinion, they were all great. And in the opinion of most fans, they were all great. But they didn't give them time to breathe, and they didn't give them time to become what they were going to become.
I mean, we've heard so many talks about reboots, but it either hasn't had a popular cult following enough, or it's just one of those products of their times. And of course, there are many shows that are probably never going to get one because they're too dark and edgy or controversial to today's day and age.
Yeah, one I wanted to talk about, one I had written down on the original list I gave you, was Gargoyles. A lot of people don't even remember what Gargoyles was, but it was one of...
Keep binging Gargoyles.
Yeah. Yeah, it's... So... It was one of those mid-90s cartoons that was... Disney was trying to make the Savage Dragon, is what I always joke about anytime I'm talking to anyone about Gargoyles. They had a well-known television and book and comic book writer come in, and Greg Weisman, and run the show. He came in, he ran the show, he did a great job. He made a beautiful, poignant comment on... race and difference and even disability multiple times throughout the show, while still telling an entertaining story. It was a very good example of a show being diverse while the diversity is at the heart of... Yeah, it's at the heart of the show.
There, but it's just not, hey, check it out. We got frickin' every color of the human rainbow.
Yeah, and it's not there just to be there. The diversity was added in organically, as I feel like it would have been in real life, and it gave us this view. It gave us this window into a lot of things we didn't see back then. And a lot of people say the Power Rangers was heavy-handed with their diversity. I disagree. I think they did a fine enough job.
Say that if you add anybody who's not a white character.
That's
Unquote.
true. That's true.
And
I
it's
agree with
honestly
that.
kind of sad nowadays because many of the people I have in my X-Men cast are in white, including the theme song writer, our Jubilee, the woman we got to play Storm, the woman we got to play Cecilia, our Black Panther. Those are just a few off the top of my head. If I'm missing anybody, I apologize for that. We got like over 60 people for that cast.
That's awesome. That's a heck of an undertaking. Trying to put together something for X-Men.
China, but he was a white guy that moved to China.
But I think it's the point of you have to realize what you're doing for diversity's sake, and you have to realize that you're putting it out here into a possibly, especially nowadays, a possibly hostile environment, because I feel like we've gone backwards in a lot of ways in those respects. But I don't know. Gargoyles, of course, was about a clutch of gargoyles that were turned to stone. And then a very rich man brought their castle over and broke the spell on them by putting them above the clouds in New York City, and they fly around New York City doing Batman stuff.
Yeah,
and
if you told me that was part of the DCAU when I was first watching it, I would have believed you, because Jen said in the first episode,
yep,
gun safety.
Oh, that episode almost got the show canceled. So gun safety was beginning to be a huge deal back around that time, because you were having your first American mass shootings that were happening. And one of the first ones actually happened here very close to me. I'm in Fort Smith, Arkansas. One of the first school shootings ever happened in Jonesboro, Arkansas. People forget about that one. People forget about that one because it happened so close with Columbine. But it was during that time that everything was kind of a powder keg that they did that episode. And they did that episode based on the fact that a young boy had shot and killed his 9-year-old brother. Because he was playing with a gun, and they did that episode. And that's another thing that they have brought back. They are continuing the series. They have deleted season 3 and are continuing the series through comic books.
And I actually have read some of the comics. Pretty good stuff.
Oh, yeah, it is. And I'm kind of glad they went the direction they did, because I don't know if you could reboot or continue Gargoyles nowadays. If you did, they would have to do what Kevin Smith did and put it on Netflix as a, adult rated series, because kids nowadays, just to be frank, the Blippy generation couldn't handle Gargoyles.
Yeah, it's funny. Kids can handle gender identity, concepts of sex changing, but they can't handle gun violence. It's like, no, you want to mutilate your genitals? We can definitely talk about that on a kid's show. But you want to put a gun on there, it's like, no, that's too risky.
I think it's important to talk about both. And I think it's important because I have known kids who had that, what they would call in certain Eastern cultures, had that dual spirit inside of them, or had questions. And I do know that they grew up to make the choice to switch, and it definitely wasn't through any kind of indoctrination from their parents, because their parents were absolutely against it from the very beginning. But I think it's important to talk about both of those things. I think it's important that we share the world through a lens of kindness and through a lens of protection, that we tell our kids about what's in the world. But I think there's a huge problem nowadays with parents and children getting offended by hard-hitting subject matter like gun violence, or even like, transgenderism. And it's one of those things that resonates on both sides of the aisle. And you're going to have someone from one side of the aisle or the other have a problem with anything that is the slightest bit shocking. And I was talking about doing shocking things for the value of shocking people. I blame a lot of these properties that are just for the shock value for a lot of what has happened in outrage culture. I think it is. I think outrage culture is something that has been cultivated. I think it's been politicized to the point that we feel like we need it now to protect ourselves. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, I feel like that's a thing, because if you start talking about, you know, LGBTQ issues or transgender issues, you're going to cause one side of the aisle to be triggered. But then if you start talking about, as you said, gun violence or domestic violence or what have you, you're going to trigger that other side of the aisle.
Well, it's funny,
And
there are actually shows that do both really well. Any of Vizzy Pop's properties, like Hell of a Boss or Hazbin Hotel, are two great examples.
sure, yeah, I agree. I can agree with that. Now, I
make it like the overall theme of the show. I mean, yeah, it's LGBTQ friendly, but there's way more of those characters than who they choose to sleep with.
as there should be, because there is no person in the world that is part of the LGBTQ plus community. There is nobody in the world that is their every waking thought, is that, oh man, they get up in the morning and think I'm gay. They eat their breakfast and think I'm gay. They take their morning shower and think I'm gay. It's not one of those things. I DJ'd in a gay bar
too, by the way.
Yeah, Archer did it, and Archer did it just fine. And I worked in a gay bar for 15 years. This is something that most people know about me. I DJ'd in a
bar for gays, or is that a bar made by gays?
So it's a bar made by gays. That is a very good distinction. I'm very happy you said that. That makes me super happy that you asked that question, because no one ever does.
Well, a bar. This is 2024. We can't assume anything right now. So I'd like to be as explicit as possible.
Yeah, same. Very much.
Stupid questions.
Very much. So, no, it was a bar built by the gay community here locally. It had been around for quite a few years before I got involved with it. Actually, probably not. It only been around for a couple of years before I got involved with it. I started DJing some. I started working the door. I did all kinds of things, and it changed. I come from a very small town in Oklahoma, and it changed my outlook on a lot of things and made me realize that this country was built so we could be who we are, and as long as we're not hurting anyone, no one else should have a problem with that. You would think. And but so through that, I learned that a lot of folks, a lot of my friends who happen to be LGBTQ will say, come Pride Month, they'll say, wow, I wonder what corporate entities are going to be corporately gay this month.
Yeah, see, that's the biggest problem I have with all these dedicated months to a particular group. I mean, for the record, I have no problem with how you identify, who you choose to sleep with, your background, but you're basically going out of your way and saying that this shouldn't be a part of regular history, and it is. You're just looking for a reason to market and segregate yourself.
I think it's more of a signpost rather than a segregation. I think it's more of a signpost. Like, you know, we have May. I hear a lot of folks who argue against Pride Month or Black History Month. I'll always hear the argument, oh, we don't have a military appreciation month. We do. May is military appreciation month. My dad was a 32-year veteran. My wife was 8 years in the Navy. I come from a military background, and we do have that month. And I think it's very important for us to have that month. I think it's very important for us to have Gay Pride and Black History Month, Native and Indigenous History Month, because, and this is something I say, being a white appearing person, I'm a quarter Cherokee, I'm a quarter Native American, being a white appearing person, every day is about me. Like it's still in this country that every day is about us who are white of skin. And I think it's important for marginalized groups to have months. Now, where I think it goes wrong is where we have corporate entities trying to be people again. That bothers me very heavily when these corporate entities come in and say, hey, we're going to brand everything rainbow this month, because
America was built on several things, including capitalism. So as a businessman, I kind of, and I say this kind of, respect them for that, but as a person, that's just really messed up.
I agree. Yep. I understand where you're coming from. And I tell people all the time, I tell people anytime I do a workshop, whether it be for acting or writing, because I do both, I tell them all the time, you are a product and you need to get used to this if you want to be in the entertainment industry. You are a product. You will always be a product, and you have to look at yourself as a product. It is not something you should think down upon yourself for. It is not a bad way of looking at yourself. You are a product. Go market yourself. So I see.
Phrase to the old expression: no matter what you do for the rest of your life, you'll always be working in sales because you're trying to sell yourself.
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. And that's a that quote is an amalgamation by some modern businessman. I want to say it's Mark Cuban, but of an old Carnegie quote, where Carnegie, paraphrasing, basically says, and Andrew Carnegie had his problems, don't get me wrong, I don't worship him like some folks do, but he did say some very poignant things as well. He said, a man must know what he is worth to survive.
That
and
is an excellent quote to live by, and I think
it's horrible, but
yes,
it's true.
But many things nowadays are horrible to some degree, but I think we just need to take it with a grain of salt.
Right. You can't get caught up in, and that's wow, what a great segue to the point I was trying to make with all of this. We all get caught up in these tiny little nuances and points of life. We all get so offended by the tiny things that I was having a conversation with a gentleman that almost markedly disagrees with me on everything from abortion to who should be president next. He agrees with me, almost disagrees with me on almost everything.
And
but
he's still keeping contact with him.
Sure, yeah, he's one of my close friends, but he says to me the other day, he says, why is it that you can have a conversation without screaming in my face? And I told him, I said, man, and when he listens to this, he'll know who I'm talking about. But I told him, I said, man, there's no point in me screaming in your face. That's just going to make you hate my views more. Like there's no point in me screaming in your face, and I'm not going to change your mind. You're not going to change my mind. And, so yeah, that's a lot of things, and it's a great segue into something else we were talking about as we were talking about reboots, was how fandoms change things as they are being rebooted or as they are being moved into other media.
I mean, even with new reboots or new continuities, we do have the possibility of adding new characters.
Sure.
Harley Quinn, X-23, Bebop and Rocksteady, Lockdown, just to name a few.
Yeah, and it's, and even changing those characters or bringing them, I don't want to say bringing them more to the forefront, but making their lives turn in a different way than they have ever turned before. You can look back to the 90s again and look at, Sam and Twitch from Spawn. When they made the movie and there was no Sam and Twitch, I was super ticked off. But then when they made the animated series and Sam and Twitch were so heavily involved in the animated series, I was like, yes, this is fantastic. This is great.
I would say,
and
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say my biggest problem with introducing new characters, or at least relatively new characters, is how much spotlight they get. Like, say, Deadpool, who only made his debut in the 90s, is one of the most recognizable Marvel characters, and they got like 8,000 some odd to work from. Harley Quinn is also the same way. She was supposed to have just like one appearance, but then now I just feel like she's getting so overly used, with Batman properties to having her own show to Suicide Squad stuff.
It's fan continuity, and I always go back to, with this, I always say the most monolithic example is Daryl from The Walking Dead. That character did not exist in the comics. In the TV series, he was meant to be a deus ex machina to get them out of one building. He was supposed to die with his brother on top of the building. That's how it was supposed to go.
Any series you have is going to eventually introduce a quote-unquote filler character. Anime is well known for this.
Oh, of course.
But Westerners just say non-canonical.
Yeah. And I mean, you come across that in so many different so many different things, and a lot of the stuff that has happened with the Masters of the Universe once again was the introduction of good lord, I forget her name. I have an action figure of her sitting on my shelf.
I know you're talking about the main character of that series. That's not He-Man.
Well, no, but Tila was a character in the original series.
Well, the main character always was the titular He-Man.
Sure,
And his
but
unaltered ego, Adam.
But they introduced the other character who was kind of Tila's second in command there for a while.
All right, yeah, no, now I know who you're talking about.
And I can't remember her name to save my life, but you know, a lot of people had problems with her. She was a decently rounded character. She added to the story. I didn't have a problem with much of anything that occurred, except for, and God love him, Mark Hamill. Skeletor sounded like the Joker
He
constantly,
really did.
and I had such a problem with that.
We do recognize Mark Hamill's talent.
Oh yeah, no, Mark Hamill's amazing, an amazing voiceover talent, and he's a good person in many ways, but he just brought too much of the Joker to Skeletor, I think. And I think we missed the seriousness that made Skeletor both an interesting and funny character. Because as a child, the best part about Skeletor was he took everything so seriously. He took everything so seriously to a fault that it was funny when he failed. And I feel like Mark took that from us.
Logic. Shredder,
sure.
Megatron, Cobra Commander, they all followed the same formula.
They did. They did, and it's funny because we began to make fun of it in the 90s, and in a lot of my writing, once again, not to self-promote, but in a lot of my writing,
you can self-promote. That's it. If you do it again, I'm going to have to charge you.
a lot of these villains that I write about in my stuff are tropes from the 90s, so they're basically troping the trope. They're basically satirizing the satirization of 80s villains, because you look back in the 90s at villains like Rita Repulsa, even though she was technically an 80s villain because coming from the original Super Sentai series that had started in the late 80s. So Rita Repulsa was technically an 80s villain. But yeah, then you get Lord Zed, Ivan Ooze, you know, all of these Power Ranger characters were probably the best example of the 90s satirizing these 80s villains. They were larger than life and taking everything seriously, but ultimately were just hilarious.
Well,
and
it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's actually kind of how Xanatos came into fruition. He is the man with plans upon plans, which is kind of funny. It's how it's the opposite of the Kobayashi Maru.
Oh yeah,
even though
absolutely.
that show had a stupid amount of Star Trek actors in there.
Absolutely.
Franks, Marina Sitaris, Michael Dorn, LeVar Burton, and my personal favorite who they got to play Puck was, damn, I'm spacing on his name right now.
Oh Lord, give me a second, because yes, it's super important.
Young Justice.
He was, and I can't.
It was Data's actor. Gonna kill me now.
While I'm searching this up, good Lord, Brent Spiner.
Brent Spiner. He was in frickin' The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, it's Data and Lore. You know, were two of my favorite characters. And speaking of characters that are a duality and characters that aren't one-note jokes.
Well, that's typecasting. I mean, we've had a fair share of actors that done that. Frickin' Aquafina and all of her voiceovers. Rodney Dangerfield was kind of like that when he was alive.
Oh, for sure. No, absolutely. Rodney Dangerfield
was pretty much that character for all those Don Bluth movies.
Absolutely, 100%.
A good portion of them. I mean, do I think Aquafina should had a little more subtlety to her voice? You know, kind of mix it up. Yes, and I have given shit about her before, but she does have good comedic timing.
And she does what she does, man. Like she is what she is. I think it's very important to say that people like that are important. people that are the Dwayne the Rock Johnsons are important to entertainment. We have to have them. Not everyone can have this huge depth,
or at least some sort of audio range to them.
yeah. Not everyone can do that. And I was thinking about Nicolas Cage recently, and everybody talks about fantastic actor. I love what he does. I think he knows what he does. I think he's very self-aware of who he is and what he's doing in the films when he's doing it. And I just think a lot of people aren't aware of what he's doing. And I think he's created this weird niche for himself. And I think that's the same thing with Mark Hamill. Even though Mark Hamill is a great character actor in many ways, Mark Hamill always has that center of himself that is Mark Hamill. You can always hear a voice and say, "Oh, well, that Joker is Mark Hamill," or that Joker is, this Joker actor, that Joker actor.
John DiMaggio or Brent Spiner,
Yeah.
or if you remember back from the early 2000s, Kevin Michael Richardson.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, you have so many people who have their own thing.
Well, I think this goes back to the whole typecasting, and I actually did an episode about this with one of the X-Men cast. Basically, how acting is in voice acting. There's a lot more nuance to it.
There's a big difference. But I also tell folks when they're voice acting, it's very hard. We had this issue in filming, or in rather not filming, but in recording. Multiple times I've seen theatrical actors try to do voiceover acting. I'm like, okay, you still need to act your character. And they look so confused at me. And that first take invariably is them reading off the page. They are just reading off the page. They're just reading the words that are on the page.
Well, isn't that basically cold reading?
I have to go. It is, but the cold reading is usually done before you start recording. You usually have a table read so that can get done. And I tell them, I'm like, okay, guys, here's what you need to do. You need to have a conversation, because you're not having a conversation. And so very often we'll just sit down and talk for a few minutes, and then they'll go back into the booth, and I'll say, hey, keep that tone. Excuse me. I'll say, hey, keep that tone you had.
I've dealt with. I mean, granted, I'm working with 60 people all across the country, and 3 of them are actually in 3 different countries.
Sure.
But I've had at least somewhat of a conversation with them. Even if it was just a texting aspect, they at least understand the way I talk. So I am going to agree with you on that.
And it's just it's a lot of people think there is a huge difference between acting and voice acting. And of course you cannot say that there's not. There is. You get the whole physical aspect into physical acting, and you start having to deal with neutral mask and neutral man, and having to deal with your quote unquote ghosts, which I could do a whole podcast episode and have before on on neutral mask and neutral man. But
I think the big aspect for when you're voice acting, which is I call the method. It's an acronym I've coined up, and it stands for enthusiasm for your character. Robin Williams did that to Death with Jeannie, like up to the point he was actually improvising lines.
Sure.
Research. This is usually done for more animalistic roles. Frank Welker should easily be on the Mount Rushmore of voice acting, due to the fact that he does 3 things well. Villains, animals, and teenagers that like to solve mysteries.
That's fun. That's a nice quote.
Thank you. And the last one is, this is debatable, range. I mean, that really separates the goods from the greats, in my opinion. Or
100.
Or at least what would you call a voice technician, like the likes of Steve Bloom, Jeff Bennett, or Frank Welker, or even Tara Strong for that matter.
Oh yeah, for sure. And with the example of Tara Strong, or Bloom for that matter, God love him. He's a great guy, by the way. If he listens to this, hi. I doubt he will, but
No, but if you do, I have taken his classes. He's probably
I've taken his
amazing.
classes as well. Yeah, and I've met him too at conventions and things. He's a great dude. But something he does very well is he has a foundational technique that he uses to approach every character. And I think that's very important in your range. And I do teach that in a couple of acting classes that I have taught in the past is you have to have your foundation to be able to have your range. And I feel like there's a lot of folks who have that Jennifer Lawrence view on acting.
Which is
That
like you're there, but are you really there? Is that what you're
yeah, yeah, exactly. She says, I told someone a while back, I said, she's a fine actress. She's fine, but she often feels like she's phoning it in. And then it told me in an interview why she felt like she was phoning it in sometimes, because she said, acting is a job, the ultimate job for lazy people. And I said, wow, that is such nonsense, because I will
thought
never
it would be an OnlyFans. That would be the ultimate job for lazy people.
I don't know, man. There is a lot of work required for that stuff. There's a lot of active marketing required for OnlyFans stuff.
Or I guess maybe
But
a TikToker.
yeah, maybe TikToker, if you catch on virally, could be a nice lazy person thing. But as I said, when she first said that back in the 2010s, we were in the middle of a production of Lend Me a Tenor, and they would have to bring out a mop and bucket between scenes because I was sweating so much that people were sliding down in it.
Well, see, there you go. That's an excellent example. I'm actually doing a lot. I'm kind of the Frank Welker of the group, where a lot of the roles I've done are more animalistic. I've actually driven up to like 3 different zoos to see how the animals move and how they communicate with.
It's important. Yeah, a
really
lot
is.
of people think it's silly, but it's important.
No, it really is. 2 well-known movies, The Hobbit and the Guardians of the Galaxy, actually had their actors go to a raccoon sanctuary and a reptile house just for that reason.
Yeah, and if you watch some of the making of The Hobbit with Benedict Cumberbatch, and all of the physical work he did with Andy Serkis's people, crawling around that stage and doing such wonderful work, it's amazing to watch, and you realize, wow, he is really a fantastic actor. When you watch those types of things,
It really is. I think it really gives depth to rebooted content.
that's another good point about rebooted content, though.
Let's
Often,
look at the 90s Disney films. They pretty much had all the animal-based characters by Frank
Sure.
Welker.
Yep.
Now it's all Alan Tudyk stuff. Which, not that I'm knocking him down or anything. It's a torch must be passed kind of situation.
I cracked a joke the other day because we were watching Wish. I don't care, by the way, what the critics say. That movie was just fine. It was just as good as Frozen. I don't know why everyone hated it. It was just as good as Frozen.
It was just as good as Frozen.
It was just as good as Frozen,
okay,
in my opinion. I'm not the guy who thinks Frozen was some kind of groundbreaking, wonderful thing. It was fine. It was a Disney film.
You saved it.
No, dead seriously, I don't think Frozen is like the greatest Disney movie of all time. I don't think Frozen can stand up to the golden era, in my opinion. And maybe that is just generational bias.
I think it could be. It also did basically follow the same formula as Lion King. The ruler has some sort of internal conflict. They leave. The kingdom goes to shit. They have another quote-unquote ruler who's kind of going power hungry. The actual ruler comes back. Things go status quo. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it's a very Hamlet way of things, and I mean a lot of things have been since the Lion King.
Hamlet's only difference is that the true king never left, but
right. But I mean, it is. I mean, the Lion King is based on Hamlet.
Well, it's also based on Kim with the White Lion, but
for sure.
For another day.
No, absolutely is based on Kim of the White Lion. And as you say, it could do a whole series of episodes on things about Kim of the White Lion that are interesting, because I've researched it a lot because I watched it as a kid. But
I think as long as we're talking about reboots, could a lot of the Twelfth Night. And
Oh, it has been.
Midsummer's Dream.
Yeah.
Could that be rebooted considering the many issues we face today?
It doesn't see a lot of screen, but in the stage it is rebooted quite regularly.
At least influence thereof. I mean, even anime
Yeah.
had influences from Shakespeare. Like,
Sure.
you ever catch it? I strongly suggest you watch Ouran High School Host Club.
Oh yeah, yeah. Familiar with it? Have watched a few episodes. Have never finished it, for sure. But I know the parallels there from the 3 or 4 episodes I've seen. Also, I think it's important to say that Shakespeare was one of the best writing collectives that has ever existed. William Shakespeare was not one person. He was one person, but those plays were not written by one person. That is
like how Studio
one.
Ghibli is kind of the same way in terms of how Miyazaki created Studio Ghibli, but not all the films were written and directed by him.
Sure, that's a good analogy. Yeah, I mean, you have the films that were directed by his son, you have the films that were directed by his business partner that are much different than his own, and that I think would be the same thing as the way the Shakespeare Collective worked. There is no way that all of those plays were written in that time by the same person. And also
a shit ton of ink and bird feathers.
Yeah, it would. And also the writing styles are completely different from one play to another sometimes. And so it's
funny enough, this is how also relates back to Gargoyles.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Puck, the Third Race, the Othello love triangle between Coldstone and his personalities.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got
I want to say Romeo and Juliet between Goliath and Eliza Maza.
Yep, you've got the Hamlet callbacks. You've got Macbeth as a named character. I mean, it's yes, heavily Shakespearean influenced there.
Which I have to say, my favorite episode was the Mirror episode where Brent Spiner makes his first debut as Puck. Love it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love how serious Gargoyles has gone. But it was just fun to see a zany thing. It's like,
but he was dangerous.
Wishes, but I'm going to grant them the way I want to grant them.
Absolutely,
kind of like a monkey's paw situation.
Very much so, but he was dangerous. It reminds me of Batman the Animated Series in that Joker was always hilarious, but obviously dangerous. That 100%.
I guess like Mr. Mixia-Spitalik.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's very dangerous. I mean, it's like the clown. Thinking of Spawn, it's like the clown. The clown is hilarious, but you have to remember that inside that clown is the Violator, who's very serious. So, I mean,
that kind of goes with his alternate personality as Owen.
Yeah.
And it was funny at the very end of the series episode, he grants Damona's wish to, walk out during the sunlight, but she becomes human.
Oh yeah, and that's been since retconned, but
in like one of the comics.
Yeah, the comics have completely retconned the final season. They've completely
just
wiped
the final
it away.
Season. Yeah, no, season 3. I mean, save for episode 1.
Episode 1 was great. Episode 1 was supposed to be the end of the series. Episode 1 still stands canonically.
It's just episode 2 onward didn't need to happen. It
was horrible.
The human transformation thing, I think that's still very much canon.
It is still canon in that she can turn into a human during the daytime, but if she does, somehow I believe she turns to stone at night, or something like that. I can't remember exactly how it works, but it is definitely still a plot point. And they still reference the Mirror episode, of course, during it. But yeah, as for retconning things in reboots and changing things in reboots, I think there should be a point, and I think this is either oversimplifying or too on the nose or however you want to describe this, but I think there comes a point where when folks are retconning things, when folks are making things new and rebooting things, they need to say, hey, look, fans, here's what has happened. Some things are going to be changed. Some things are definitely going to be changed in this. Don't expect this to be a continuation of what you enjoyed or an exact remake of the thing you enjoyed.
Well,
I think
it
that
has
would
to
get
go to
studios out a lot of hot water.
a degree. Like, okay, here's an idea for a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle reboot. Instead of Bebop and Rocksteady being mutated into a rhino and a warthog, how about them just being mutated into a hippo and a mountain goat, but they're still called Bebop and Rocksteady? Do you think that would hold well with the fans?
I think as long as they saw it coming, it might. And depending on how much you change the
Oh no,
the
that's like the
personalities.
only change. I mean, there's still the dumb, stupid henchmen.
I think as long as you don't change the personalities too much, I think it'll be just fine. I think a lot of the reasons why folks liked the second Michael Bay Ninja Turtles more than they liked the first one was because of the presence of Bebop and Rocksteady.
Well, and Krang, but
And Krang.
I mean, he at least tried to make it a little more serious, more accurate to the comics than the frickin' Transformers thing.
You got to enjoy Transformers for what it is. I've been saying this for
let's enjoy Velma for what it is.
I mean, you do. You have to.
Like, and here's a piece of shit. Just enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah, here's the thing. Rings of Power. I'm eventually going to have to get through that. I hate it. I think it's written very poorly. I don't really care so much that it craps on the source material as that I think the writing sucks. And I'm going to have to eventually get through it. And someone told me the other day, they said, hey, just imagine to yourself you're watching a bad B fantasy film. And I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to go into it to. And you know, I watched an episode and it was actually decent. I was expecting Nick Cage to pop up somewhere, but aside from that, it was actually pretty decent when I watched it with that frame of mind. And that's another thing that's very important, I think, is frame of mind. We can't walk into this stuff expecting our childhoods to pop back out. It makes it all the more sweet when they do.
I think that was the first issue we had with the first X-Men reboot. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was nice seeing a lot of the Beast Wars voiceovers in there.
Yep.
It was nice introducing X-23. It was good for its time. But I felt like they took so much stuff that they really changed it.
You're talking about Evolution?
Yeah, I'm talking about Evolution, yes.
Yeah. I have this thing with Evolution where I know a lot of other people hated it. I thought it was great. And it was one of, I don't know if it'll stand the test of time. I'll be honest with you. I probably haven't watched it in 6 or 8 years, an episode of it at all. But it's this perennial problem with things that when something is rebooted too soon, it tends to be affected by what happened before it. And let's all be honest, and I'm probably going to get crucified for this. The last season of X-Men, the animated series, was not the best season.
Well, I mean,
of X-Men, the animated
so a lot of fans will agree with you on that.
And I see a lot of things that have happened in X-Men 97 that have tried to fix the problems that occurred. Is some of the fixes were a little heavy-handed, like, you know, Charles still being alive and living with Lilandra. All of that was a little heavy-handed. I felt like they could have gone about it in a different way, but I think it's great the way they're setting up the Onslaught storyline. I think that's going to be fun. I think it's going to be fun to see Age of Apocalypse stuff, or just straight up Onslaught. They may skip right over that and go straight into the Onslaught saga, which will be fun too, especially with Jean Grey just coming out of all of the crap with Sinister, going directly into Onslaught is going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting.
Madeline Pryor looked really good for a woman who just had a kid.
Great, man. I don't know how she got that. Danger Room does wonders.
It's just clone logic.
Yeah, that's what it. I think that's probably what it was. I love Madeline Pryor. I'm maybe the minority, but I've always loved the character. I've always thought she was a very deep and interesting character, even during like the Claremont era and the more shallow action based era. I think her character was pretty
Well,
deep, pretty
let's
cool.
talk about this for a second. A lot of people say that X-Men have always been woke. To some degree, that's true.
Agreed. Yeah,
For when
100%.
it became popular, when Claremont took over, it's been a little more woke. But when we go back to the original 96-63 comic, it was just your stereotypical good versus evil aspect.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it was Claremont did change everything.
I mean, from freaking Magneto's backstory to having different individuals of different races. But just, what really makes it not woke is that that's not their whole background identity.
I'll go on the record saying that I'll never think that woke is a bad adjective. I think it's a much better thing to be woke than to be an asleep sheep. But and just
But
follow the
you just don't wanna go crazy
status quo.
with it.
But everything in moderation. I'm very much a centrist.
I think we can work with that, but problem is, I personally feel like Hollywood is stupidly overcompensating for essentially what was starting out with Hollywood media.
Some studios and some aspects of some studios are doing it, and I think they're only doing it for monetary gain. I think you'll find in those situations they have been doing it for monetary gain. It's a lot of the decline in quality of the Marvel series is because we went from writing good storylines that happen to be about diverse characters to injecting diverse characters into fairly lazily written storylines and thinking, okay, there's a diverse character in here, this is going to be fine. And
right, and if you hate it, that makes you racist.
I think to a degree that can be argued. Definitely. I don't know if that fine a point can be put on it, but I think to a degree that can be argued for sure.
Well, let me ask you, did you like the Little Mermaid movie? The one with Halle Bailey, not the original one.
I have to be 100% honest. I have not watched it yet because I have not watched a live action remake of a Disney film besides Beauty and the Beast since Lion King, because I thought the live action remake of Lion King was horrible. Yeah, if you can call it that. It was CGI remake of the Lion King. It was horrible, and unpopular opinion again, I hate Seth Rogen. Sorry, I think his Ninja Turtles remake was fine. I liked it. I enjoyed The Next Mutation. My kids loved it.
Take or leave Seth Rogen at this point. I mean, he's funny.
He didn't pay his animators on 2 different movies. He didn't pay his animators, and he can really take, when Danny McBride, and I love Danny McBride. Let me point out before I say this, there's nothing wrong with Danny McBride as far as anything goes to me. I think he is the perfect mixture of being kind and not being tone deaf and also being edgy with comedy. I think he may have been involved in it, but he's the guy from Eastbound and Down, Vice Principals,
The Righteous. The guy that was playing Hyde.
No, not that guy. That guy can eat one. He's got a similar name to Danny McBride, but no, that guy can jump off of a short cliff.
I mix my actors up, but I think that.
Yeah, I do too. I can't remember that guy's name all of a sudden, but. Anyway, no, with Danny McBride being the guy from Eastbound and Down, Vice Principals, Righteous Gemstones, when he distanced himself from Seth Rogen, it was because Seth was having some issues being a person, and he wasn't paying his.
Look at Santa Inc. For God's sakes.
Yeah, no, it's a horrible.
Don't get me wrong, it's good to watch when you're stoned, like a lot of his content is, but if you're in clear mind, you got to ask yourself. Why?
Takes me back to the whole thing where we said people should not push diversity just to push diversity. You should not push stoner content just to push stoner content. It needs to have some substance. Yeah, it needs to have some substance outside of it. Kevin Smith does that really well, I think.
You know what show does that really well, honestly? Smiling Friends does that really well.
From what I have seen of it, I have stumbled onto one episode of it before because someone else was watching it. But yes, from what I've seen of that, I think the IT crowd did a great job of it. I think most of Kevin Smith's properties do a really good job of it. But it goes back to the point, and this is a very good point to make. Kind of, I guess we're close to wrapping up. This is a very good point to make toward the end of something talking about reboots. You cannot inject any agenda into something and make it
agenda, but that really separates the good storytelling to the marketing
well.
platforms.
You can have an agenda, but you cannot make that whole show about that agenda. There has to be other aspects.
Well, I mean, just look at that scene with Endgame with Spider-Man. They had to have all the women protect him. It's like, why though? It's like, so do you just need a reminder of all the women that were a part of Avengers and whatnot? You know, in case we forgot.
It was a little heavy-handed. I will admit to you, it was a little heavy-handed.
It's like, no, good. She's fine. We just need a Captain Marvel.
Yeah, that was not needed 100%. There were a lot of things that weren't needed in a lot of that stuff.
I mean,
but
for the record, a lot of the Harley Quinn stuff, Marvel isn't just guilty of it. I felt like there was really more agenda pushing in the later seasons. It's like, okay, now you got your own identity outside of Joker, and that's great. But as the series progressed, and I'm using that term lightly, it really became more of a thing of female power.
I think it did, and I think it was organically going to become that, but I think it was the job of the showrunners to make it not become all about that.
It did.
Yeah, I mean it kind of did. And there are a lot of things that have become that way. But as far as reboots go, I think the most important thing that can be done is making something new while still having reverence for the old property.
True.
Easier said than done.
I mean, that's why a lot of the DCAU stuff worked really well.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, on top of it's fantastic casting, but that's just an argument for another day.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I am going to have to bounce on you shortly.
Well, this is a good point to wrap up. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Geek Talk with Tyler. Feel free to catch my co-host in any of his multitude of social platforms, including on Facebook. And if you like this episode, tune in next week as we talk about how characters have been saved by fandom. So if you like this episode, hit like, subscribe, and follow for more content. But no matter what you decide to do, stay geeky.